My cellmate was branded a child predator and tormented daily by inmates and guards. Then he revealed the soul-crushing truth about why he actually called his own kid, and I've never felt more conflicted. I was serving the second year of my 3-year sentence when this bald guy with a mustache named Peter arrived as my new cellmate. The guard leading him kicked him in the back before closing our cell, then from behind bars sarcastically told me not to mention my kids around this freak. I instantly jumped up. My own child had been assaulted, so I approached Peter and asked him bluntly to tell me what he did to those kids. But Peter didn't say anything. Instead, he just looked at me with these eyes that I'd only ever seen in wrongfully convicted prisoners. I ended up letting go of him, but because of how suspicious I was, I started watching him carefully, and what I saw was basically what I expected. You see, it's no secret that predators aren't exactly treated well in prison, and that was the case for Peter. During his first breakfast, someone poured scalding coffee over his hands. That same day in yard, this guy named Bookie stabbed him in the side with a screw. Later that night in our cell, I saw him peeing blood from all the injuries. The guards were basically even worse. I remember one of the times Peter put in an application to go to medical with a broken rib after falling and just never heard back. Another time I witnessed a guard enter our cell at night just to wail on Peter. He was even outright stabbed in the shoulder with a glass shard by one of the pigs. But the strangest thing was, despite everything, Peter was the nicest guy I'd ever met. He shared his pain meds with me when medical refused to see me. He fixed the broken wheelchair of the vet who lost his legs, and when one of the new guys got word that his daughter died, Peter held him in the way only a father who'd buried his own child could. Everything changed the day I was in the laundry room by myself. I had just finished saving up $800 to buy my daughter the college textbook she needed and was planning on how to convince her mother to spend it on that instead of drugs. That's when Bookie, who was an ex-human trafficker serving life, cornered me with one of his people. He said he'd heard from one of the guards that I had money in my account, and unless I give it over, I could kiss my daughter goodbye. He then pressed a tiny blade against my neck and told me I had 10 seconds to make my choice. I remember swallowing dryly, my mind racing for some sort of way to get out of this. "Listen, Bookie, we can—" "Ah!" My words were interrupted by Bookie's henchman screaming. Bookie instantly turned around, where he was met with Peter, pressing a sizzling hot iron into the other guy's back. Bookie's face went white, and when Peter locked eyes with him, he didn't hesitate. He lunged at Bookie with the iron too, pressing it into his cheek, leading to Bookie dropping on the floor as well. Both of them were screaming in agony, and me and Peter just scrambled to get out of the laundry room. That night in our cells, Peter told me he'd heard what Bookie said to me. He said that he once had a daughter too, and added that anyone who comes between a father and their daughter needs to be punished. Unfortunately, standing up to Bookie meant problems for Peter. The very next day, he was taken out by one of the guards and brought to the warden. I don't know what happened there or why, but Peter was placed in solitary confinement for the next 30 days. When he returned, he was a shell of his former self. He had new bruises, as if someone was somehow able to get near him. He'd lost so much weight, he was literally anorexic. And when I asked a guard what happened to him, I was told to mind my business unless I want the same treatment. The thing was, Bookie was out of the infirmary by this point, meaning it would likely only get worse for Peter. 4 days passed before it happened. I was cornered by a guard while waiting for Peter to be done in the showers, who told me that for my own good, I should head back to my cell. At first, I told him no. I was waiting for Peter, but then the guard just looked at me. He pulled out a photo of my daughter and asked if I was sure I wanted to wait for Peter. The implication was clear. I knew what was about to happen, and I felt terrible leaving Peter behind. But if it came down to him or my daughter, the choice was obvious. I remember just grinding my teeth in frustration before turning around and walking out. I heard the sound of someone getting punched basically instantly. That sound was then followed by muffled screaming, and then that same sizzling sound I'd heard before. I felt myself start to tear up. Peter only came back to our cell a few hours later. By that point, he had already been discharged from the infirmary. He had sustained 4 broken ribs, a broken nose, 3rd-degree burns on his back and torso. 2 of his teeth had even been pulled out. Yet from what he said, medical barely looked at him. They refused to give him pain meds, refused to let him spend the night there, didn't even stitch him up, just wrapped his injuries in bandages that were already seeping through and walked him back. Once our cell door closed, he couldn't even make it to his bunk. He just collapsed on the floor, not even moving, making these wounded animal sounds. I got down and knelt beside him. I told him I was sorry, that I wanted to help, but they threatened my daughter. Peter didn't even get mad when I told him. He said I made the right choice. He told me he would have chosen his daughter over me too. That's when, while still lying on the floor, Peter asked me if I wanted to know why he's really in here. I said yes, and he gathered the strength to sit up. It's true, I did call my own child. My face went white. Go on, I said hesitantly, but only because I found out he was working with Bookie. I stared at Peter's battered face as he struggled to continue, while down the hall, Bookie's crew gathered outside the infirmary, plotting their next move against us. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows across his swollen features. Peter shifted on the floor, wincing as fresh blood seeped through his bandages. His hands shook violently as he tried to steady himself against the wall. Through broken teeth, he whispered the words that would change everything everything I thought I knew about him. My son Marcus started small, running packages for dealers when he turned 20, said it was just temporary money. Peter's voice cracked, and I watched his hands tremble harder, like leaves in a storm. The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. Peter's son, not some random victim, but his own flesh and blood. I leaned closer, my mind racing to process what I was hearing. Peter forced himself to continue, each word seeming to cost him. He explained how Marcus escalated from substances to moving people within 2 years. The progression had been gradual, insidious. First, it was just packages across state lines. Then it became documents, fake IDs. Finally, it was people, desperate souls looking for a better life who found only slavery. My stomach turned as I realized Bookie wasn't Peter's first encounter with trafficking. This went deeper than prison politics or random violence. This was personal history bleeding into the present. A soft, scraping sound made us both freeze. Rodriguez, my work detail buddy from 2 cells down, slid a folded note under our door. I grabbed it quickly, unfolding the paper with trembling fingers. The message was brief, but terrifying. Bookie paying guards triple rates for special handling tonight. Watch your backs. Peter saw my face pale as I read. Without asking, he understood. He forced himself upright, using the wall for support, his decision clear in his eyes. He would tell me everything before Bookie silenced him permanently. With each movement, blood seeped through his bandages, creating dark stains that spread like accusations. The lights suddenly flickered off, not the usual power-saving dimming, but complete darkness. Maintenance, the automated system announced, but we both knew better. This was orchestrated. The guards were creating opportunity for retaliation. In the darkness, Peter's voice found me. He described finding evidence of Marcus's activities hidden in their garage, photos of terrified young women with price tags attached, shipping manifests with human cargo listed as merchandise, bank statements showing deposits that no legitimate job could explain. The emergency generator kicked in with a mechanical whine, bathing everything in sickly yellow light. My blood ran cold. 2 of Bookie's men already stood at our cell door, jingling a guard's keys. Behind them, the guard himself counted a thick wad of cash, not even pretending to hide the transaction. Peter shoved me behind him despite his injuries. His legs shook from the effort of standing, but his voice was steady. He told them he'd come quietly if they left me out of it. Just him. No one else needed to get hurt. The men laughed, a sound like breaking glass. The taller one, a guy I recognized from the kitchen crew, shook his head. Bookie wanted us both now. Me for the disrespect of interfering, Peter for the scars he'd given their boss. Just as they fumbled with the lock, a commotion erupted from the neighboring cell. Wallace, an old-timer who'd watched Peter help others for weeks, suddenly clutched his chest and screamed. He collapsed dramatically, gasping about heart pain. Can't breathe. Need help now. The performance was Oscar-worthy. The guard cursed, torn between his paid job and the liability of a dead inmate. Wallace sold it perfectly, even managing to wink at Peter while clutching his chest in apparent agony. The guard had no choice. He radioed for medical, and within seconds, the corridor filled with responders. Bookie's men melted back into the shadows, their opportunity lost, but not for long. As the medical team worked on Wallace's miraculous recovery, Bookie himself appeared at our cell. Bandages covered his burns, but his eyes burned with something worse than pain. He gripped the bars, knuckles white, and made his proposition. He would reveal the full truth about Marcus. Every detail, every victim, every horror, if Peter took his own life tonight. One life to know the complete truth about another. I opened my mouth to tell Bookie exactly where he could shove his deal, but Peter grabbed my arm. His grip was weak, but insistent. I looked at his face and saw something that terrified me more than any threat. He was actually considering it. Peter reached under his mattress with shaking hands and pulled out a hidden photo. The edges were worn from handling, the image faded but clear. A young man at 18, innocent and smiling at graduation, hope radiating from every feature. Peter's voice broke completely as he held it toward Bookie. When did Marcus first contact you? The photo trembled in Peter's grip, and I noticed bloody fingerprints from his injured hands staining the white border. Bookie's smile was pure poison. He claimed Marcus sought him out at 21, already experienced in moving product. The kid had ambition, Bookie said, wanted to expand from packages to live cargo, had ideas about efficiency, profit margins, market expansion. Before Bookie could continue his sick sales pitch, the warden's voice boomed over the intercom. Surprise cell inspections, effective immediately. All inmates to remain in cells, all non-essential personnel to clear the blocks. Bookie's crew scattered like roaches when the lights come on. Even Bookie himself had to retreat, but not before promising this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The inspection was a joke. The warden himself led it, stepping directly over Peter's blood on the floor without comment. He glanced at Peter's visible injuries, the seeping bandages, the swollen face, the way he could barely stand, and marked his clipboard. No issues noted. As he turned to leave, I saw him pocket something Bookie had left behind. A small envelope, probably more payment for looking the other way. Once we were alone again, Peter told me about hiring a private investigator when Marcus's behavior first changed. The man was good, experienced, had worked missing persons cases for 20 years. He got close to the truth, sending Peter updates about Marcus's associates, his movements, endorsements, his growing wealth. Then the updates stopped. The PY's office was found ransacked. His car was in the river. His body was never recovered. I helped Peter back to his bunk as he talked, trying to make him comfortable despite his injuries. The next morning came too soon, bringing new revelations. In the yard, while Peter struggled to walk his mandatory laps, Santos approached. I'd seen the lifer watching Peter since his arrival, always from a distance, always with an unreadable expression. Now he came close, rolling up his sleeves to reveal a constellation of knife scars. "I knew your boy Marcus," Santos said simply, from the outside. Peter stopped walking. I thought he might collapse, but he held himself upright through sheer will. Santos described Marcus's reputation with clinical detachment: young, smart, utterly ruthless. He specialized in teenagers because, in his words, they were easier to break. The scars on Santos's arms, those came from Marcus personally, when Santos tried to protect his cousin's daughter from recruitment. Even Santos, who'd seen decades of prison violence, looked disturbed recounting it. Marcus didn't just move people, he broke them first, ensuring compliance through methods that made hardened criminals flinch. Peter's body finally gave out. He vomited blood onto the yard concrete, and I realized with growing horror that he was dying from internal injuries the medical ward had ignored. Every beating, every untreated wound, was adding up to a death sentence. I supported him back to our cell, but news traveled fast in prison. Valdez, a trustee who cleaned the warden's office, took an enormous risk. He slipped Peter a folder he'd photographed, Marcus's arrest records showing multiple dropped charges. Peter's hands shook worse than ever as he read. 3 investigations dropped after witnesses vanished. A 15-year-old girl who escaped Marcus's operation and tried to testify. Her statement mentioned Bookie by name before she disappeared. The records painted a picture of escalating horror. Marcus personally disciplined girls who tried to run, using methods that made even Bookie's torture seem mild. Peter read each page like he was swallowing glass, absorbing every detail of what his son had become. That night, Bookie sent word through a guard. Tomorrow, Peter would learn what happened to the 9-year-old girl that finally made him act. The message was clear. The worst was yet to come. Peter spent that sleepless night hunched over scraps of paper, writing letters he'd never send. I watched him work by the dim emergency lighting, each word carved out with trembling hands. The papers were attempts to reach Marcus that had failed over the years. Birthday cards returned unopened. Graduation congratulations that came back marked refused. One letter bore dark stains from when Marcus had attacked him during their last meeting. The depth of Peter's guilt became clear as dawn broke. He'd been absent during Marcus's crucial teenage years, chasing promotions and overtime while his son drifted into darkness. Every missed baseball game, every canceled weekend visit, every broken promise had widened the gulf between them until it became an abyss. At breakfast, the cafeteria atmosphere shifted when we entered. Inmates who normally mixed freely now segregated themselves, avoiding our table like we carried plague. The isolation broke when Williams, a soft-spoken man doing 15 for armed robbery, carried his tray to our corner. His jaw was set with determination. Williams sat down heavily and revealed why he'd come. Marcus had tried to recruit his daughter 2 years ago. She'd been walking home from her job at the mall when a young man in an expensive car offered her modeling work. Something about his practiced smile and 2 smooth words had made her nervous enough to call her father. The daughter escaped because a neighbor, an off-duty cop, had intervened when Marcus became insistent. But 2 of her friends from the same mall weren't so fortunate. Williams still carried their missing person flyers, worn soft from handling. Both girls had vanished within weeks of meeting a charming young man who promised them better lives. Peter absorbed every detail Williams shared, documenting patterns despite the visible agony each revelation brought. His notebook filled with times, dates, locations, a father's desperate attempt to understand the monster wearing his son's face. A guard approached our table carrying a small package. He dropped it in front of Peter with deliberate casualness before walking away. Inside was a photograph from the prison commissary, a child's pink sneaker, size 2, lying in dirt. A note was attached. "She fought harder than you did." Peter's entire body went rigid. He recognized the shoe brand immediately, the same type he'd bought for Marcus when he was 9, before everything went wrong. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. His hands shook so violently he couldn't hold the photo steady. I spent the morning using contraband cell phones, desperately trying to verify my daughter's safety. The guard's threats had seemed like standard intimidation, but Bookie's reach was longer than I'd imagined. Every unanswered call, every text that went unread, tightened the knot in my stomach. Martinez from my work detail found me during afternoon rec time. He'd mentioned working courthouse maintenance during orientation, but never elaborated. Now he revealed he'd been there when Marcus's cases were heard. The lawyer defending him was infamous, a man who specialized in making trafficking charges disappear through technicalities and missing evidence. Peter shared his own attempts to work within the system. He'd confronted Detective Morrison about Marcus's activities, bringing evidence he'd gathered himself. Morrison had examined the photos and documents, then calmly threatened to charge Peter with harassment if he didn't drop it. 6 months later, Morrison retired early with a pension that didn't match his salary. Bookie's deadline arrived with the setting sun. Through intermediaries, he set terms. Peter would learn everything everything about the 9-year-old girl, Emily, but only if he agreed to end his own life afterward. The knowledge would be his final torment. Chen from the library block approached Peter during evening count. I'd heard Chen bragging about his computer crimes, identity theft, financial fraud, the works. Now he admitted, with obvious shame, that he'd helped Marcus create false identities for trafficking victims. New names, fake histories, documents that would pass any inspection. Peter's fever spiked that night from untreated infections. In his delirium, he called out Marcus's name repeatedly, begging forgiveness from both his son and the victims. Other inmates turned away, unable to meet his eyes. Even hardened killers have limits. Bookie's psychological warfare intensified with another message. This time it was a photograph of Emily before Marcus took her, a bright-eyed girl at her 9th birthday party, cake frosting on her nose, surrounded by friends. The innocence in that image made the implied horror unbearable. Word spread through the block like wildfire. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Card games were abandoned. Even the constant background noise of prison life seemed to quiet. Crimes against children that young crossed a line that united even sworn enemies in revulsion. Peter forced himself to study Emily's photo with the intensity of a detective. He recognized the neighborhood immediately, just 2 blocks from his own home. The school uniform she wore came from Marcus's old elementary school. The realization that his son had hunted so close to home, in their own community, broke something inside him. The shift in prison dynamics became undeniable. Inmates who had shunned Peter now offered quiet support. A member of the Southside crew slipped him extra food. The Muslims included him in their protective circle during yard time. Even some guards seemed uncomfortable with Bookie's campaign. Through the contraband phone network, inmates' families began sending information. Photos arrived of items found in Marcus's abandoned storage unit, trophies Peter recognized from victims, a charm bracelet Marcus had given his first girlfriend, a class ring that didn't belong to any school Marcus attended. Each item represented a life destroyed. My loyalty to Peter solidified as he shared more details. He'd tried everything: interventions with family, therapy sessions Marcus mocked, even having his son arrested for assault. But money always intervened. Charges were dropped, witnesses recanted. The system that should have stopped Marcus instead enabled him. Peter made his choice clear to anyone who would listen. He refused Bookie's offer of Sewer's lied. He would live with the weight of truth, honor the victims by bearing witness to their suffering. Death would be an escape he didn't deserve. During shower time, Peter confronted Bookie directly. The confrontation was brief but explosive. Peter announced he already knew what Marcus had done to Emily. He'd been there for the aftermath. The confidence drained from Bookie's scarred face like water from a broken cup. Peter's health deteriorated rapidly, but he managed to trade commissary items for antibiotics another inmate had hoarded. Without proper medical care, it was the only treatment available in our corrupt system. The pills were expired, but they were better than nothing. Bookie's crew began showing cracks. Learning about Emily changed the dynamic. These were men who'd done terrible things, but crimes against children that young violated even their twisted code. Several members distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with child trafficking. The tide turned decisively when Big Tom, the shot caller for the entire block, made an announcement during evening rec. Peter was now under his protection. Tom's own granddaughter was Emily's age, and the thought of what had happened sickened him. Anyone who moved against Peter would answer to him personally. Inmates mobilized their outside contacts to investigate Peter's claims about police corruption. Phone calls were made, old connections activated. The network that usually smuggled contraband now hunted for truth. Evidence began trickling in. Photos of Morrison's new boat, records of deposits that coincided with dropped charges. Peter revealed more details about Marcus's final hunt. Phone records had led him to discover Emily's location after she'd already been taken. She'd escaped from wherever Marcus held her, but she was just 9 years old, alone, terrified. She'd vanished, trying to find her way home. Word spread that Peter had exhausted every legal channel before taking matters into his own hands. He'd filed reports, hired lawyers, contacted federal agencies. Every door had been slammed in his face. The system protected Marcus, while Emily disappeared into darkness. Bookie's options narrowed as his own crew questioned their association. Working with child traffickers was bad for business, even in prison. The unwritten rules that governed their world had been violated. Honor among thieves didn't extend to those who hurt children. Santos revealed what the streets had known, but police ignored. Marcus had been hunting for Emily after her escape, checking homeless camps, questioning other street kids. The search had been methodical, desperate. Peter confirmed the terrible truth. He'd followed Marcus's hunt and found Emily's body first. Peter's transformation affected younger inmates profoundly. He taught them the warning signs of traffickers, the smooth words and false promises that lured victims. His informal classes during yard time drew growing crowds. Knowledge became his weapon against future predators. The Vietnamese gang threw their support behind Peter after their leader learned Marcus had specifically targeted girls from their community. The trafficking had been systematic, exploiting language barriers and immigration fears. 3 girls from their neighborhood remained missing. Bookie's attempts to turn opinion against Peter failed spectacularly. His rants about Peter being a child killer rang hollow when everyone knew the truth about Emily. The more Bookie pushed, the more isolated he became. His own criminal empire crumbled from within. The prison chaplain, who'd maintained careful neutrality, finally took a stand. He'd seen Peter's medical records, the documentation of systematic abuse and denied treatment. Even a man of God couldn't ignore such injustice. He began advocating for proper medical care, using his influence with administration. Peter's reputation completed its transformation. No longer seen as a child killer, he was recognized as a father who'd done what the system wouldn't. The same men who'd attacked him now offered protection. The guards who'd tortured him now avoided his gaze. Rodriguez from the kitchen had been present when Bookie ordered the hit on Peter. He'd memorized every word, every detail. Now he agreed to share that information with other inmates, creating a witness pool Bookie couldn't eliminate. The truth spread through every tier. My release date loomed just days away, forcing an impossible choice. I could walk out, return to my daughter, pretend none of this happened, or I could risk everything to ensure Peter survived long enough for justice to find its way. My daughter needed me, but so did the memory of Emily and every other victim. Bookie's mask finally slipped completely during a rant in the yard. He forgot himself, referring to Emily and the others as merchandise and inventory. The slip revealed his true nature. These weren't people to him, just products to be moved. Even his own crew stepped back in disgust. The stakes crystallized for everyone. This wasn't just about Peter and Bookie anymore. It was about every Emily who never got justice, every parent who lost a child to predators, every system that failed to protect the innocent. The prison became a courtroom where society's failures were being judged. Peter demonstrated real growth by finding the strength to fight back rather than accepting death. He stopped calling out Marcus's name in his sleep. He ate regular meals. He participated in daily routines. Forgiveness, not for Marcus, but for himself, gave him the will to continue. Key inmates began rejecting Bookie's blood money. His offers of commissary credit and protection fell on deaf ears. Conscience, that rare commodity in prison, suddenly became more valuable than any bribe. Men who'd sold their souls for less now found their limits. Even corrupt guards started distancing themselves from Bookie. Association with child trafficking was career poison. The protection racket that had operated for years began to crumble. Guards who'd struck Peter now looked the other way when inmates moved to protect him. Peter won a small but significant victory when the night nurse, risking her job, properly treated his infections. She cleaned and dressed his wounds, administered real antibiotics, documented his injuries accurately. It was the first real medical care he'd received since arriving. Healing began, inside and out. Bookie made one final desperate offer. He would confess to authorities about his involvement with Marcus if Peter would admit to lying about everything. He wanted Peter to say Marcus was innocent, that Emily never existed, that it was all a delusion. The offer revealed Bookie's true fear: official investigation. Peter laughed at the proposition, a sound like breaking chains. He knew Bookie's confession would only confirm what Peter already knew. The truth was already spreading beyond prison walls. Marcus's victims were being identified. Their families were asking questions. The house of cards was collapsing. Bookie's outside contacts abandoned him en masse. His lawyer stopped taking calls. His money transfers were blocked. The network that had protected him for years dissolved overnight. Nobody wanted the heat that came with child trafficking connections. He was radioactive. Relationships throughout the block solidified along new lines. The Muslim Brotherhood offered Peter protection during prayers, transcending racial divisions that normally governed prison life. They recognized a father's pain, understood the impossible choices love sometimes demanded. In the most unexpected development, the Aryan gang sided with Peter. Their leader had 3 daughters on the outside. The thought of what Marcus and Bookie had done to children overrode every other consideration. United by paternal instinct, sworn enemies found common ground. Peter used the testimonies he'd gathered to piece together the full scope of Marcus's operation. The pattern was horrifying in its efficiency. Over 30 victims identified so far, with more emerging as families came forward. Each name added weight to Peter's burden, but also strengthened his resolve. The breakthrough came when Peter remembered something Marcus had said during their final confrontation. His son had bragged about keeping detailed records, insurance against his partners. Those records were hidden in the family cabin, the place where Peter had taught Marcus to fish before everything went wrong. Through coded letters to his lawyer, Peter hinted at the cabin's location, hoping someone would eventually search it. The process took weeks of careful wording to avoid prison censors, while still conveying the crucial information. Each letter built on the previous one, creating a trail of breadcrumbs only someone motivated to follow could piece together. Documentation surfaced, proving Detective Morrison took bribes to bury cases against Marcus. Morrison's own handwritten notes, recovered from a safety deposit box during an unrelated investigation, detailed payment schedules and case numbers. The evidence painted a clear picture of systematic corruption that had protected Marcus for years. A guard who found his conscience approached Peter during morning count. The man had worked the prison for 15 years, but couldn't stomach what he'd witnessed anymore. He revealed that prosecutors had finally searched Marcus's apartment after receiving receiving anonymous tips. They'd discovered victim records Marcus had kept as insurance against his partners. The block collectively judged Bookie guilty of enabling child trafficking. Indigenous prison justice operated on principles older than any court system. Men who'd committed various crimes united in their verdict. Some sins crossed lines that couldn't be forgiven. During mealtime, Bookie launched a desperate attack. He'd filed a spoon handle into a crude shank over several days, hiding it in his waistband. As Peter reached for his tray, Bookie struck, driving the weapon into Peter's kidney. The makeshift blade penetrated deep, and blood immediately began pooling with the spilled food on the cafeteria floor. Peter collapsed as I applied pressure to the wound. My hands pressed hard against the bleeding while Bookie stood over us, claiming self-defense to anyone who would listen. He insisted Peter had threatened him first, that this was justified retaliation for the burns Peter had given him. Witnesses wavered between truth and survival as guards demanded statements. The corrupt officers wanted testimonies that would support Bookie's version of events. They offered commissary credits, phone privileges, even sentence reductions for anyone willing to lie. The pressure was intense, but something had shifted in the block's collective conscience. I held Peter's wound closed alone as medical staff delayed their response. The guards had clearly instructed them to let Peter bleed out before providing aid. Each second stretched like an hour as I felt Peter's life seeping between my fingers. He whispered Emily's name repeatedly, his voice growing weaker with each repetition. Making a critical decision, I began screaming for help while claiming Bookie had just confessed to enabling child trafficking. My voice carried across the cafeteria, forcing witnesses to choose sides. I announced that Bookie had admitted to supplying Marcus with victims, that he'd bragged about it while stabbing Peter. The accusation triggered a cascade of responses. Inmates who'd been wavering suddenly found their voices. They began shouting their own accusations, revealing what they knew about Bookie's involvement with traffickers. The cafeteria erupted as men revolted against guards who would allow a child trafficking enabler to murder someone seeking justice. All parties converged in the cafeteria as inmates surrounded Bookie. I maintained pressure on Peter's wound while the circle tightened around his attacker. No guards dared intervene. They were outnumbered 50-1, and the mood had turned dangerous. Even guards who weren't on Bookie's payroll understood that protecting him now would mark them as complicit. Truth and lies clashed as Bookie desperately claimed Peter had fabricated everything. He insisted Marcus was innocent, that Emily never existed, that this was all an elaborate lie. But Williams stepped forward, producing Emily's missing person poster from his pocket. The faded paper showed a smiling 9-year-old who'd never come home. Bookie's last secret emerged when Santos confronted him directly. Santos revealed that Bookie had supplied Marcus with girls from juvenile detention facilities where his sister worked as a counselor. The sister would identify vulnerable targets, girls without strong family connections, runaways who wouldn't be missed immediately. She'd pass their information to Bookie, who'd arrange for Marcus to recruit them upon release. Big Tom stepped forward, his massive frame commanding attention. He announced that Bookie's fate had been decided by unanimous vote. The block had held an informal trial while I'd been tending to Peter. Every crew, every gang, every independent inmate had reached the same verdict. Even members of Bookie's own crew stood aside, unwilling to defend him any longer. Peter faced his final moral choice as he lay bleeding on the cafeteria floor. Through tremendous effort, he raised his hand, gesturing for Tom to stop. He asked only that Bookie live with what he'd done, that death would be too easy an escape. Peter's capacity for mercy, even while dying, stunned everyone present. But the block overruled Peter's plea for mercy. Prison operated by different rules than the outside world. Here, crimes against children demanded a specific response. Peter's forgiveness meant nothing in this context. The collective had already passed judgment, and their verdict was final. Bookie, sensing his fate, made one last, desperate move. He pulled another weapon from his sock, a razor blade melted into a toothbrush handle. Rushing at Peter with sewer's-lidal determination, he seemed intent on taking Peter with him, or dying in the attempt. The charge was clumsy, driven more by panic than skill. As Bookie charged, Peter weakly raised his food tray in defense. The aluminum tray should have offered little protection, but Bookie's momentum worked against him. He stumbled over spilled food on the floor, his trajectory shifting at the crucial moment. The makeshift weapon glanced off the tray's edge and, driven by Bookie's own force, plunged into his throat. Bookie collapsed beside Peter, blood spurting from his severed artery. He bled out faster than Peter, his life draining onto the cafeteria floor in minutes. His last words were a gurgled attempt to say Emily meant nothing, that she was just another product, but the words died with him, unfinished and unheard by most. Peter survived because media attention arrived at the perfect moment. My smuggled calls to journalists over previous days had finally borne fruit. A reporter investigating prison corruption had received my messages about systematic denial of medical care. The story was already being prepared when Bookie attacked, and the reporter's inquiries to the warden created immediate pressure. Administration couldn't afford another death under suspicious circumstances, while journalists were asking questions. Medical staff suddenly appeared with proper equipment. They stabilized Peter efficiently, providing the care they'd denied for weeks. Sometimes exposure saves lives simply by making neglect too costly to continue. Bookie died unmourned while doctors worked on Peter. The cafeteria slowly emptied as inmates returned to their cells, the normal rhythms of prison life resuming. His body was removed without ceremony, another casualty of the violence that plagued the system. Official reports would list it as self-defense, which was essentially true. Final obstacles to Peter's recovery disappeared as corrupt guards transferred out. They knew their protection racket was exposed, that investigations were coming. Rather than face scrutiny, they requested reassignments to other facilities. Their replacements were carefully selected officers with clean records who wouldn't tolerate the previous arrangements. A new equilibrium formed within the block. Peter, once recovered enough to leave the infirmary, became an informal educator. During yard time and meals, he shared his hard-earned knowledge about trafficking warning signs. He taught younger inmates how predators operated, what promises they made, how they identified vulnerable targets. His classes weren't official, but they were well attended. My release date arrived with Peter finally stable. He'd survived multiple surgeries and was expected to make a full physical recovery. The psychological wounds would take longer to heal, but he'd found purpose in preventing others from experiencing what Emily and Marcus's other victims had endured. On my last morning, Peter handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a detailed letter for authorities about the cabin's location, along with specific dates and records they should search for. He'd also included contact information for other victims' families who deserved closure. The letter was his insurance policy. If anything happened to him, the truth would still emerge. I walked out of prison with Peter's letter and a promise to ensure Emily's story reached the right prosecutors. Peter would serve his remaining time with dignity intact, surrounded by men who now understood why he'd done what the courts wouldn't. Bookie's death had been ruled self-defense, and the block was safer without trafficking connections poisoning it. Some sins can't be forgiven, but some fathers understand why Peter did what he did. We both carry our daughters in our hearts as we face whatever comes next. The system had failed Emily and dozens of others, but Peter had ensured Marcus could never hurt another child. It wasn't justice in any legal sense, but it was the only resolution available when every proper channel had been corrupted. The prison walls that had confined Peter now protected him from those who'd preferred Marcus's crimes remain hidden. Inside, he'd found an unexpected community of fathers who understood his choice. Outside, I carried his truth toward whatever justice remained possible.